first time for us seeing that introduction. I wish Eric was here for us to thank. But thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. My name is Ryan Pellegrino.
And I'm Alex Smith, and tonight we're going to be talking to you about the art of second impressions. A little bit about us before we get started. I'm a senior majoring in political science and journalism from Newmarket, Alabama. I'm absolutely obsessed with the new hit TV show We the People. It's about like lawyers. And I'm also super terrified of the dentist.
And I'm a senior as well. I'm studying engineering and math. I'm originally from Maryland. I'll be up in DC next year. Admittedly, yes, I do have a Jeep with my name on it an obnoxious number of times, and it does come off as a little pretentious.
And this was, in fact, my first realization that Ryan was kind of a self-absorbed, pretentious individual. He also really emphasized me when we first met. I'm not from the North, I'm from the Mid-Atlantic. So this was kind of, my first impression of Ryan, and also the fact that he ditched me like the first time we were supposed to hang out in New York. So really it just like snowballed from there, and it was a disaster.
Admittedly, Alex and I did not have the best first interaction, or second one for that matter, both of which are probably my fault. But as of this weekend, we've been together for 8 months, and we're here to talk to you a little bit about both what we've learned on campus as well as in our relationship and outside of it, about first impressions, second impressions, what it means to really form better relationships. We're going to start by laying the foundation and talking a little bit about what a first impression looks like, both scientifically and anecdotally.
Then we're going to touch on how to fix that bad first impression we make and how we can make the most of second impressions to improve our future relationships and interactions.
We're going to wrap up by telling you how you can kind of turn the tables on this and keep an open perspective and not let other people's first impressions of you be too permanent or negative.
So first, what is a first impression and why is it so important? Whether you've only known us for the 30 seconds that we've been up here or you've known us for years, you probably already have a good idea of who we are. A fairly obnoxious couple, but we have so many first interactions in our day-to-day lives.
I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to some of the different anecdotes and examples. So maybe you're in an interview for something on campus for an internship or something like that, and from the moment you step in the door, it's just a disaster. You clam up, you can't even speak, it's all downhill from the very start. Or maybe you go to a professor asking for help studying for a test or a homework problem or something like that, and you walk in the door and they're like, you didn't work hard enough on this. Bad first impression. Maybe you were trying to impress a girl and you tried to take her to your office where you had your internship and she hated every single second of it, and I thought it was a foolproof plan. Clearly it was not. We only have basically a tenth of a second to form these initial impressions based on kind of our body language and our kind of physical persona that we are conveying.
So this means when you meet someone for the first time or you're making a first impression, it's basically the look that you have on your face. Research shows that a lot of people look at the eyes and the mouth when you're meeting someone for the first time to determine whether or not you're approachable or even if you're trustworthy.
And after that, you leave a couple more moments until someone's forming a semi-permanent impression of you, whether that's positive or negative.
And this sucks because we're obviously not our best selves 24/7. Or sometimes we're in environments where we're not necessarily ready to make that first impression, or we're not necessarily our normal selves. For example, I've been a Crimson for the past 4 years for the University of Alabama, and if you see me on game days and I look like this, and I obviously don't look like that any other day of the week. So there have been times where I've had to meet people on game day, and then I'll see them two days later on campus, and they're like, wow, like, you look really tired. I'm like, yes, I don't look like this all the time, but that was their first impression of me. That was the first time that they got to meet me.
So jumping into a little bit of science behind it, it comes back to a phenomenon called thin slicing. It doesn't quite refer to how you like the crust of your pizza. It refers to basically how we take half a second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, some abbreviated amount of time, form an opinion or a judgment, and then apply that judgment to the broader context that we're looking at, or any sort of experience that we have. So there are two main psychological biases that we want to kind of touch on that factor into this. The first is the primacy effect, which basically states that the first kind of experience or anything you read, the first of the list, whatever comes first, you have more time to rehearse in your mind. You have a better chance of encoding that in your long-term memory.
The second is called confirmation bias, and that's when we selectively seek out information that basically confirms beliefs and ideas that we already have. You can kind of think of selective views consumption, where you're also actively ignoring information that doesn't necessarily agree with your current ideas or beliefs.
There are a lot of positives and benefits, both from an evolutionary standpoint and today for this sort of thin slicing, but it's really easy to see what the negative consequences look like in today's society. So let's jump back to the original interview example that we gave. maybe you miss your alarm, you are completely rushed walking out the door, and you come to your interview looking super distracted. Bad first impression right from the get-go.
Yeah, so this actually happened to me on campus while I was rushing to an interview for law school, and I tripped and fell down the steps and like ripped my pants, not like SpongeBob style, but like knees ripped, blood on my legs. It was like an absolute disaster. And so I walked into the room and they were like, "Whoa, like, are you okay?" And I was not okay. It was a really bad interview, and a really awful.
She followed me. It was a bit of a disaster, but it worked out. But she had to get past that first impression. Additionally, if maybe you go into that interview and you botch the introduction, it's extremely awkward, you go for a handshake, and it's like you kind of halfway grab their hand, you know that you don't want to acknowledge how awkward it is or go again, but like you have to move past it. These sort of just kind of subconscious biases stick with us throughout an interaction and color the rest of the context of whatever interview or experience you're having. Even if you kill the rest of the interview, even if you are perfectly qualified for the job, it is extremely hard for a person to get over that initial feeling that you provide them.
So how do we go about fixing that awful first impression that you just made? We need a second impression because the first 30 seconds that you meet someone just simply isn't enough time to determine whether or not they're worthy of a relationship, a friendship, a job position, or a leadership position on campus. First impressions only really capture one dimension of a person, and sometimes first impressions aren't even always in person. Sometimes they're on paper.
So, how do we take these second impressions and make the most of them? Obviously, you need to force repeated interactions. If you make a bad first impression and just let it lie, there's no way that that person is going to think differently of you for any reason. You don't give them a reason to. So first of all, we can find ways to force these repeated interactions in new contexts. Say I meet somebody at work and it's a disaster. Maybe I spill my coffee on them. Maybe I say something rude. Maybe it's just I don't give off great vibes. It's rough from the start. But a week later, maybe I run into them at a social event, a party, or a dance, and we have a great time. After that sort of second impression, that person's brain is conditioned to think, okay, Ryan sucks, except when he's at a party or at this social event. We create these exceptions to the rule based on the environment that we're in when we form these second impressions. So it's up to us to force more repeated second impressions and interactions in different environments until we create overwhelming evidence that we maybe don't suck that much.
One recent example of me having to create an exception to the rule was my applications to law school. I did really bad on the LSAT. I'm talking so bad, I was like, there's no way I was going to get into any school that I was actually applying for and wanted to go to. So I emailed schools incessantly. I emailed them, I wrote extra essays, I made phone calls to convey that I was actually interested in these schools and in the legal practice. And so while the LSAT is like the determining factor for how well you're going to perform your first year of law school, I was able to convince these schools that there was more to me than just a score.
And we can also try to force these interactions in the same context, but create different power dynamics. So going back to the work example, if you put yourself in a position where you're working on a project or initiative that this person formed a bad first impression with, you are somewhat responsible for their success or for their outcomes. And when that situation arises, our brains are forced to reevaluate the negative first impression that we made on them. And so you create that second chance for you to prove yourself in the same context, but now that you have some sort of influence or some sort of power over what they think of you, you can really make the most of it.
We can also make the most of second impressions by finding common ground. Full disclosure, Tide Talks is an apolitical organization. However, I consider myself kind of a political person. If you know me, I've been kind of outspoken about some things as far as the Greek system goes, SGA, and like kind of the machine. So, yeah, I didn't make a good first impression on these organizations, and they most certainly did not make a great first impression on me. However, after sitting down with some of these people, especially in SGA, I was able to talk to some of these people and find common ground. We were vulnerable with one another. We talked about the things that mattered, what we wanted to do on campus. We ultimately wanted to help people. We just had different ways and means of achieving it, and that's okay. So I was able to partner with SGA this past year on a great initiative to raise a lot of money for kids within our own Tuscaloosa City school system. And I think that's certainly more important than our differences, and I love that we were able to put those aside and find that common ground for a greater good. When approaching a second impression, it's important to remain humble, especially if it was your fault that the first impression went poorly. Then you need to go into a second impression very optimistic and over-prepare.
Again, a lot of you guys can relate to an example that I can give personally. Last year I was a junior. Everybody's looking for that post-junior year internship. I applied to probably 50, 60 some different applications. Got denied from just about all of them. It was rough. I went into interviews underprepared. I went point, I was cocky, I was overconfident, and then when I got in the room, things kind of fell apart. But I reevaluated myself, I looked at these different opportunities and understood how much I wanted them, and so I followed up with all these different interviewers. I reached out to different representatives of the companies that I was looking to work at, and I made sure that I called them, I met with them, I emailed them repeatedly. And every single time I put myself out there, I conveyed my enthusiasm. I talked about how grateful I was for the opportunity for them to even kind of look at me or talk to me again, and I made sure that I was over-prepared every single time to make the most of every single opportunity.
For our last point, I'm not sure if we have any Myers-Briggs fans out in the audience or anyone in the Honors College, but we're going to talk about the importance of having an open mind, and instead of judging, we're actually going to work to see things from perception. So we're going to talk about having an open mind, how you can do that on both the giving and receiving end of a second impression.
So obviously we're up here. We can acknowledge that we have these biases and these subconscious kind of misconceptions about first impressions in general. That's the first step.
Basically, just don't be judgy. Apply the golden rule. Treat others the way that you would want to be treated. It's that simple. And if someone's approaching you for a second impression, don't view it as if you're doing them a favor. View it as you would want someone to do the same for you if you were in that situation of wanting a second impression from somebody.
And there are practical, less kind of generalist ways for us to apply this in our own lives and here on campus. If you are in a student organization or you're managing any sort of like application or interview or audition process, be blind. Use blind screenings as much as possible. Try to find ways to remove identifiers or any sort of, identifiers that could lead to you having misconceptions or preconceived notions or even bad vibes in the slightest about what this person brings to the table. Look at them for who they are underneath whatever the titles and labels that you may associate with them originally are.
And it's also important to capture like a holistic view of a person and individual. Bear with me as I go back to my Princeton example, but we have lots of different components to our trial. An individual round, a group round, an interview round, all these different things that the judges look for in these individuals when they're auditioning to capture the full picture of the people that are auditioning. And that's the kind of thing we need to apply to our own lives, is work to get as much information about someone as possible before forming these judgments or kind of deciding whether or not it was a bad first or second impression.
Yeah, and these aren't just things to take into formal relationships or any sort of kind of interview-esque role. Take these into your conversations and your friendships and your relationships. These are important rules that you should abide by every single chance that you get. We don't want to look at people as one-dimensional or just kind of having this one sort of impression that they form through one meeting, just as you wouldn't want that for them to form that impression of you. Try to look at them, as Alex said, from a holistic manner and make sure that you're gathering as much information and giving people these second chances. Keep an open mind about it all.
So we've talked you through what first impressions are and why they matter so much, the importance of getting a second impression and how to do so successfully, and we've also talked about the importance of having an open mind when both on the giving and receiving end of a second impression.
We're all human. We all need connection for us to really be the best versions of ourselves. There is hope for a second chance despite whatever first impressions you have in any sort of manner of interaction or relationship in your life. So we hope you take these rules and these sort of tools that we've outlined here tonight and apply them in your own life. Thank you.